morning and welcome to the public budget discussion for the Winnipeg Police Board, which includes the Winnipeg Police Service. It is Monday, January 20th, and I'm happy to be joined by His Worship, Mayor Scott Gillingham, our Vice Chair, Colleen Mayer, Board Member Damon Johnson, Board Member Daphne Penrose, Board Member Diane Red Sky, who's joining us remotely, and Board Member Kevin Selch. We're joined by members of the Public Service, our Clerk, Kate McMillan, our Acting Chief, Chief Art Standard, and I'd like to introduce to the public our Board Secretary, Jeff Wiggett, who is into his second week now, and he replaces Shauna Curtin. We also have Executive Director Kim Nichols here, Executive Director Tara Holoka, Data Analyst David Bowman, and Deputy Chief Scott Halley. We also have Acting Deputy Chief Jody Sutherland. All right, so welcome all this morning. We are gathered on this very cold January day in Winnipeg, which sits on the ancestral lands of the Anishinaabe, Ojibwe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dene, and Dakota peoples, and is the birthplace of the Red River Métis Nation. And the water that we drink is sourced from Shoal Lake 40, located in Treaty 3 territory. We have some delegations today, but before we move into delegations, I need a motion to allow Diane to participate remotely. So, Mayor Gillingham, all those in favor?
Aye.
Motion carried. All right, we'll start the meeting by turning it over to the clerks to introduce the delegations. And before we do that, we just, again, would like to acknowledge that in terms of delegations this morning, we're going to be respectful in terms of our language and only provide factual information with respect to the items pertaining in our budget. So with that, I will turn it over to the clerk and we'll start the delegations.
Our first delegation, Steve Niner, is unable to join us today, so we're going to move on to James Wilt. James is joining us via Zoom. James, if you want to go ahead and unmute yourself and turn on your video, you have up to 10 minutes for your presentation.
Good morning, Mr. Wilt, and welcome to committee meeting this morning.
Morning. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Fantastic. So my name's James Wilt. I am a local advocate and also author of a recent book on the Winnipeg Police. So I'm here to speak in my capacity as a researcher and as an activist. So specifically, I'm here to oppose the proposed increase to the Winnipeg Police Service budget of $15.1 million in mill rate spending, reaching $293.1 million in 2025. Specifically, I'm calling for the WPS budget to be frozen at 2024 levels and for proposed additional spending to be reallocated to actual safety solutions, starting with refunding the community connection space at the Millennium Library. I'm thus asking police board members to consider pushing back against WPS demands for more than $40 million per year more in mill rate support by 2027 and reflect on the broader mandate of the police board itself. So there's several prongs of this mandate that I'd like to focus on today as the proposed police budget is considered. And to do so, of course, it's necessary to return to the Provincial Police Services Act that determines the responsibilities of the board. Firstly, is found in Section 27A of the Act, which requires the board to provide, quote, civilian governance respecting the enforcement of law, the maintenance of the public peace, and the prevention of crime in the municipality. So my contention here is that there's no empirical evidence that increased police funding as proposed in this budget is the best way to advance this goal. As the police force constantly tells us in their statistical reports and media statements, issues of violence and harm continue to increase year after year. A study published in October 2023 that reviewed a decade's worth of data in 20 of Canada's largest cities concluded that there was, quote, no consistent correlation between police funding and crime rates across municipalities, end quote. Even if police presence in a specific instance successfully deters a violent or harmful act in a particular place and time, which itself is, of course, incredibly contingent and uncertain, as we've seen with acts of violence happening literally outside police headquarters, That does not mean that the issue is by any means resolved. Instead, it can oftentimes be displaced elsewhere with the risk factors that contribute to the act of violence or harm completely unaddressed. And it's my contention that this does not constitute meaningful prevention in any long-term sense. In many more cases, police only respond after an act of violence or harm has occurred, or after, quote, public peace has been breached, in the words of the legislation. So this means, for example, that an assault or a robbery has already taken place, and that the victims may be suffering in any number of ways. And if the person who caused this harm is eventually found by police, which of course there's no guarantee of at all based on the Winnipeg Police's own clearance rates, subsequent criminalization does nothing to advance long-term safety. Many people come out of incarceration or out of community corrections with greatly worsened access to housing, employment, and supports, oftentimes leaving them few options to survive. And unsurprisingly, such conditions can frequently lead to cycles of further harm and criminalization. So once again, this does not represent improvement of public peace or prevention of violence as outlined in the legislation. I'd now like to turn to Section 27B of the Police Services Act, which requires the police board to provide the, quote, administrative direction and organization required to provide an adequate and effective police service in the municipality. Now, quite notably, this concept of adequate and effective policing is not defined anywhere in the legislation. In the 2020 review of the legislation by the so-called Community Safety Knowledge Alliance, wrote that, quote, nowhere in Manitoba's legislation or regulations is adequate and effective policing defined. So this lack of definition has not been rectified since, and means that this metric is essentially entirely discretionary. There's no stated goal, measurement, or ability to evaluate evidence against invested resources. So this major gap has meant that the so-called POP to COP, or officer to civilian ratio, has become the dominant metric that is used by the police and council to justify increased police funding. However, once again, there is no actual evidence behind this metric nor identification of a desired ratio for safety goals. And this is especially noticeable when we take a look at other major cities in Canada. Winnipeg reportedly has a ratio of 167.5 officers per 100,000 civilians. However, in 2023, Ottawa had 131.5, the Peel region had 144.3, Calgary had 153.1, Toronto had 167.8, Edmonton had 177.9, Vancouver with 184.1, and Montreal had 221.1. So I ask, which of these is the police board actually aiming for, and based on what empirical evidence? And what about the ongoing civilianization of police duties, which inevitably reduces the POP to COP ratio? Or the reality that 1,300 WPS employees make at least $100,000 a year, not including their enormous pension costs, which obviously reduces the ability for new hires? These are extremely basic questions that the police board and city council should be required to answer before giving the police force tens of millions of dollars more every year. The police board was not designed to be a blatant cheerleader and promoter of police force interests, or to merely accept police demands for funding without question or pushback. Yet only last week, we saw two members of this board, both Mayor Gillingham and Councillor Chambers, publicly promote the police force's desire for a new $13.5 million helicopter, only months after minor scandals about its second armored vehicle and its robot dog. The supposed mandate of the police board is to act as a liaison between the community and the police force, not automatically defending the police force against criticism from the community. If improved safety for all is a shared goal, which I'm sure it is, then continually increasing police funding at the direct expense of alternative safety solutions should be of profound concern to us all. And of course, ultimately, it is not the police board that determines the police budget, but it's city council. However, the police board offers the first opportunity to develop a distinct safety approach. I call especially on the non-council members of the police board to step up and push back against the incessant pro-police feelings of your council colleagues. There are many other avenues of improving safety and preventing violence and harm from occurring, rather than just continuing to dump more and more resources into reacting through policing, which occurs often in highly unequal and harmful ways. Such alternative approaches can begin with significantly increasing funding to community supports, starting with a community connection space at the Millennium Library, but also including dedicated youth programming and employment opportunities, safe and deeply affordable housing, and alternative non-police response options. And I know that the police board will contend that this is not within their purview, but such alternatives cannot be invested in unless police funding is frozen. Policing is an extremely expensive response to issues that are largely shaped by severe social inequalities that can be meaningfully addressed in many other and more effective ways. Rather than continue to go down this path of ever-increasing policing costs and activities, I encourage the non-council members of the police board to show courage and initiative in opposing this proposed funding increase and calling for alternative and effective approaches to safety in the city. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation this morning. Are there any questions of board members? Oh, go ahead, Diane.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Can you, I have two things. First is, can you let us know what is the name of your book that you referred to?
Sure, yeah,
and
yeah. Oh, go on, sorry.
And I'll just ask the second question and just let you go. The second one is, when you were doing your research, did you do research and compare that to other jurisdictions, or was it the city of Winnipeg only?
For sure. No, thanks for your questions. It feels weird to promote a book in the city, but it's called Dogged and Destructive Essays on the Winnipeg Police. It's published by ARP Books. And the objective of it is to take the opportunity of the centennial of the city of Winnipeg, but also the police force, to take a historical review and also try to learn from that in the contemporary context. In terms of my own research, it's predominantly focused on Winnipeg, but of course, any conversations that we have in Winnipeg has to occur within the national context and even international context. So, for example, in the case of thinking about the officer to population ratio, we look elsewhere as well. But the main focus of my research has been in Winnipeg specifically.
And sorry, just a follow-up question. Do you have any specific data, or is there anything within your book or current research around approaches, policing approaches in a as it relates to cost, like a cost benefit analysis when it comes to Indigenous people, or the role that the Winnipeg Police can play when it comes to the calls for action through Truth and Reconciliation?
For sure. Thank you for the question. So the main approach that I take to this is that policing is not the most efficient or effective means of resolving many of the issues that are in Winnipeg and in our various communities. So my contention, and what's come from my research, is that it is more prudent to reduce or at least freeze funding to the police and invest the resources that would otherwise go into policing into other safety solutions, such as alternative non-police crisis response, which has been talked about, or in providing the necessary, basic services that people need to survive so that they don't end up becoming trapped in these cycles of harm and criminalization. In terms of cost benefit analysis, I don't have that data specifically on hand, but I think at the very least, it's possible to reflect on the fact that some 1,300 members of the WPS make at least $100,000 per year in compensation, not including pensions. And if we compare that to other city services or nonprofits that are working in the city, often with very meager budgets, they are basically incomparable. And so I think that part of this problem is that the police have become sort of the de facto response to so many social crises, as they will often admit themselves. And what is needed is that for other departments, nonprofits, services, outreaches to receive similar levels of financial support so that they can begin to substitute and step into that role. So that would be my overarching response to that question.
And thank you. Any other questions? Seeing none, thank you for your time this morning, Mr. James Wiltz, and have a great day. Next.
Okay, our next delegation is Inez Bilal, joining us via Zoom as well. Inez, if you want to go ahead and unmute yourself and turn on your video, you have up to 10 minutes for your presentation.
Hi everyone, can you hear me?
Yes. Please
great.
proceed.
Yeah, I'm here today to speak to oppose the increase to the Winnipeg Police budget for 15.1 million in mill rate spending, which means that the budget will reach 293.1 million in 2025. There's so much good that 15.1 million in spending can do for people in Winnipeg, and in my view, that money would be wasted if it were allocated to the Winnipeg Police Service. I know from experience that the Winnipeg Police will use the results from their biased 2024 citizen survey, which evaluates Winnipeggers' satisfaction with the Winnipeg Police Service and perceptions of crime and public safety in Winnipeg, and they'll use that resource to make the case for why they need this funding. So I'm also going to base my remarks in that same survey. In 2024, it showed that 65% of the 600 survey respondents reported feeling very unsafe walking downtown after dark. It's also important to note that only 18% of those same respondents reported feeling unsafe at night in their own neighborhood. So then this data reveals two really interesting things. The first one is that perceptions of people not living in a neighborhood can be used as a valid justification for increasing policing in an already heavily policed area. But it also shows that so far, the existing police presence downtown, which is quite significant, has been an abject failure at providing even an illusion of safety for people. Not unrelated to that fact is that the survey shows that the Winnipeg Police Service has received its lowest rating to date. Since 2025, the confidence in the Winnipeg Police has fallen from 81% to 58%. The belief that the Winnipeg Police provides a good quality service has fallen from 72% to 54%. And there has been a significant growth in the number of people responding to the survey who think that there are too many cops in Winnipeg. Despite this year's performance will likely be rewarded with $15.1 million in additional funding from City Council, but that means it'll be first be approved by people on this so-called oversight board. Despite the Winnipeg's police shortcomings, it's undeniable that some survey respondents feel that there are too few cops in Winnipeg, so that's what 50% of respondents noted, and 38% felt that the Winnipeg Police Service is underfunded. I presume those numbers will be relevant in the Winnipeg Police's demand for more money, but I think that needs to be tied into the fact that 76% of respondents in the survey said that they found that the Winnipeg Police was a moderately or completely trustworthy source of local public safety news. So it's really unsurprising that they would then parrot the WPS's talking points about what can make Winnipeg safer. But if we don't take the Winnipeg Police at face value and we ask ourselves what other options exist outside from this continuously growing carceral apparatus that control, we're left with questions about what could it mean to rely on something that isn't policing and isn't surveillance. There are numerous evidence-based solutions that have been brought forward both as alternatives to policing and as innovative ways of fostering safety in Winnipeg. This includes, but isn't limited to, non-market housing initiatives, harm reduction efforts like safe consumption sites and safe supply, violence interruption programs and outreach programs, free transit for everyone, and so much more. The previous delegate noted this as well, but it is beyond the mandate of this board to fund those initiatives, but it does remain true that by approving the police budget, you'd be undermining the city's capacity to fund those initiatives while furthering the misguided perception that policing plays a role in meeting people's very real safety needs. As members of this board, you get to choose if you want to continue investing in the failed experiment of policing as a means of creating public safety. There's ample evidence that proves that policing does not and cannot make us safer, and a vote in favor of this police budget is to reject that evidence. It's also to say that the violence carried out by the Winnipeg Police Service this year was not serious enough for you to reconsider wanting to grow the police force, or at the very least, pause additional investments in policing to free up resources to explore other options. Freezing the police budget at 2024 levels would reflect actual engagement of what being concerned about police violence looks like, because whether it's understood as the intent or not, the reality remains that it is with funding that this board approves that police violence occurs in the city. To take that first step between ending your complicity with police violence in the city would mean freezing the budget in order to allow non-police safety initiatives to take hold in the city. It would be to reaffirm the importance of services like community connections at the Millennium Library that were wrongfully cut from this budget. Freezing this budget would mean being open to let
Can you hear us, Inez?
work of introducing safe learning outcomes and instead engage critically with what it means to fund policing in the city. Freezing the budget at 2024 levels would put an end to rewarding the violence police inflict on our communities and instead recognize the life-saving potential that non-police solutions can have. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Are there any questions of board members? Seeing none, thank you very much for your presentation this morning. On to the next delegation.
Our next delegation is Chantal Garand, also joining us via Zoom. Chantal, if you want to go ahead and unmute yourself and turn on your video, you have up to 10 minutes for your presentation.
Thank you to the previous presenters who have taken time out of their lives to research and put together a delegation here today. My presence here today is guided by my ancestors who were killed in resistance to and by this colonial government. I am a Two-Spirit Michif, and I take the responsibilities of existing as such seriously. Today that takes the form of being in solidarity globally with those resisting brutal occupation and genocide in Palestine, and the families who continue to reel locally in Winnipeg after the Winnipeg police have killed their loved ones. I also thank the chair for acknowledging the frigid weather that we are experiencing, as my mind is also with those affected by such weather events and the misallocation of city funds to protect these residents. When preparing for this, I thought this presentation would take a much different form and be very numbers and budget heavy. I think that others are able to and have covered that sufficiently. And so I'm actually left wondering what the City of Winnipeg truly uses its guiding documents and policies for. I was led down a trail of deceit with outdated information, error 404, inducing links, and the consistent need for opinion that favors a WPS narrative. Despite a WPS strategic plan that is to be informed by our Winnipeg 2045, which is riddled with references to a city wanting to be evidence-informed. As a reminder, the Winnipeg Police Board strategic plan from 2020 to 2024, under the assumption that an updated strategic plan is not yet available, the Winnipeg Police Board governs the Winnipeg Police Service through the Chief of Police and determines the direction for the overall operations of the service and delivery of policing programs. This is a pretty hefty role that, as an outsider, seems to need the board to be informed and continuously read on updated evidence-based research and data. Unfortunately, the Winnipeg Police Service does not lead the capital cities in Canada on data released to the public that shows budgetary compliance or breakdowns with the operations and delivery of policing services. I have read, with great jealousy, detailed breakdowns of, for example, the Ottawa police budget, which would allow for greater understanding of what a city proposing to spend the highest amount of any city in Canada on policing is actually doing. Instead, in our quest for transparency and accountability, we are forced to rely on the heavily skewed opinion of the Winnipeg Police and their announcements of such activities. This direction couldn't be more dangerous than when it comes to the Winnipeg Police, or to when the Winnipeg Police kills. Our Winnipeg 2045, a guiding document for the police board, continuously mentions the City of Winnipeg and all entities as such needing to be evidence-informed in all decision-making. Empirical data published in 2024 out of Simon Fraser University looked at all roughly 175 police agencies in Canada and studied the data of how often they shoot community members and in turn the frequency they kill community members. This data showed that from 2017 until 2019, the year they cut off at, Winnipeg Police led all Canadian cities in police shootings per capita. This rate, 0.58 of 100,000, was more than 12 times the Vancouver Police Department. This rate becomes even more problematic when Indigenous people are factored into account. Given the effects of colonialism can be evidenced in overrepresentation in interactions with police and the so-called justice system, as well as heavily reduced social determinants of health that oftentimes police use to justify their interactions with community members, it can be inferred that Winnipeg police are killing Indigenous people when they pull their guns. This, along with the actual reporting on who the police kill, like most recently with Jordan Charlie. This connection is important when considering above a human shouldn't kill other humans approach, and especially those who are given special powers and take an oath to protect, that the Our Winnipeg 2045 plan calls for Winnipeg to be, and I quote, a healthy city that supports the provision of basic needs, social determinants of health, and human rights through equitable access to food, water, housing, income, employment, transportation, recreation, literacy, and social inclusion. These needs are best addressed through effective cross-sector collaboration, promoting good physical and mental health for all. End quote. The last line leads to another interesting part to pull from the board's strategic plan, cross-sector collaboration. The WPS and the board both cite this in their plans as being important. However, if I can opine, in my experience from the last several years, I haven't worked at or with an organization that doesn't have a police policy in place, many of which require that cops are not allowed in their spaces, or there cannot be any uniformed cops if there is. Given that these are frontline services that have had a great enough need to enact these policies, how is it that the board plans to direct the police on making these collaborations when the organizations don't want them in their spaces because they keep killing their clients? If the service wants collaboration to reduce demand on police service, don't those services need to be funded adequately to do the actual work of helping reducing rates of so-called crime? And if there's only one pot of money from the city, it seems that there's a leak. I would like to cite one last report out of the University of Toronto in regards to all the above and the budget that you folks are here to discuss today. It shows that there is no correlation between higher police budgets and reduced crime rates. Given that Winnipeg has the highest portion of its budget directed to policing community members in Canada at over 26%, and its own statistics show that so-called crime has not decreased, does it make sense to continue to give money to a propaganda machine? In these same statistics, Winnipeg led the nation with the strongest negative correlation between the crime severity index and police funding, suggesting that what we are doing is not working. This is even more unfortunate when we understand so-called crime as being related to unmet needs, and Winnipeg furthering the gaps between those unmet needs and those privileged by doing things such as closing community connections to partially fund a year lease of a tormenting helicopter. I don't know that the chair or the mayor is willing to consider the facts of their budget allocations, but I sure do hope that the civilians who sit on this board are. In the simplest terms, the city of Winnipeg will continue to fund the discriminatory killings of its own community members, the ones that Our Winnipeg 2045 seems to be improving lives for, if it continues to increase funding for a department with no repercussions for its actions. The facts are there if you should so choose to read them. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any questions of board members? I have a quick question. In terms of any research that you've done, do you have any research that shows the correlation between low crime severity index and low police budgets?
The research in the University of Toronto report actually has graphs of all of the major cities. And there isn't, I can pull it up and I can also send it to you if you'd like.
I would. Yeah, I would like that. Do you have any data that shows a correlation between a city that has a low crime severity index and a low police budget?
Sorry, I'm having feedback.
Again, if you have any data that shows the correlation between a major municipal city that has a low crime severity index and correspondingly a low police budget.
I think the answer to that is that there isn't a city with with a low police budget. So that data doesn't exist because police are being overfunded as the apparent solution to so-called crime, when other studies show that that's not actually the solution.
So your answer is you don't have any data that shows what I've asked for?
You can't have data that shows that because there is no low police budget. police are continuously being overfunded in every major city, and it's not reducing crime. Like, that's what the data shows. There is no low police budget.
Okay, you made an argument that states that Winnipeg has a high crime severity index and is funded at a higher rate.
Yes.
Okay, so what you're saying then is that there's no instances of showing a city that has a police budget that is in line with its population and also has a low crime severity index.
I'm saying that the data suggests from the report out of the University of Toronto shows that cities are continuously overfunding the police as a response to trying to reduce crime rates, and it's not working. That's what the data shows. That's what the researchers have pulled from every municipal, like every major municipal city. I didn't make the data. I'm citing the data out of the University of Toronto. This was a 2023 report. They're the researchers. I'm citing their data.
All right, well, thank you. If you can send me whatever information you have, that'd be great.
Sure, I can send both reports that I cited.
And my contact information is online.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Any other questions, board members? Okay, thank you for your presentation today.
Our next delegation is Kyle Finez, also joining us via Zoom. You want to go ahead and unmute yourself and turn on your video. You have up to 10 minutes for your presentation.
Great, thank you. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah, thank you.
Perfect, thanks. So I am also here to speak in opposition to the proposed increase to the Winnipeg Police Service budget of $15.1 million in mill rate spending, and to advocate for freezing the police budget to 2024 levels. I'm lucky enough that I've had the opportunity to live in a number of cities around the world, despite being born and bred in Winnipeg. But despite that, I've always loved Winnipeg. I love everything about it. I love its weather, I love its people. But I love it in spite of the fact that the City of Winnipeg government doesn't always love me back. I say that because loving me might mean well-plowed streets. It might mean well-funded public transit infrastructure. It might mean access to recreational services like public pools and like libraries with hours that allow me to access them often. And it might mean providing the services to address an opioid crisis that has impacted many members of my community. All the delegations you've seen before me have very eloquently indicated, using your own facts and figures, that the monopolization of city funds by the Winnipeg Police Service prevents us from all of those things. In addition, you've heard a number of facts that indicate that not only does the Winnipeg Police Service prevent our city from flourishing in a number of different avenues, it also is ineffective at doing what it claims to do, keeping our communities safe. I think it's worth looking at the City of Winnipeg website, where there is a multi-year 2025 budget update, wherein some of the highlights of the budget are pointed to. If I may quote briefly from the section titled Investing in Public Safety, I think it's useful to examine the way in which the Winnipeg City Council attempts to defend the continued monopolization of city funds by the Winnipeg Police Service. Quote, Winnipeg is growing, but our public safety resources haven't kept pace. The ongoing opioid crisis, increasing fire calls, street violence, and aggressive retail theft are just a few of the challenges first responders face every day. End quote. Setting aside for the moment the claim that public safety resources haven't kept pace with Winnipeg's growth, I think it's worthwhile to ask whether increasing the Winnipeg Police Service budget actually addresses any of the growing challenges indicated in that passage. First, the Winnipeg Police Service does not provide care to the many people across Winnipeg currently contending with the opioid crisis. It is, as I think you all would admit, not intended to do so. Looking to actual solutions to the opioid crisis, the Federation of Canadian Municipalities released a number of recommended city-based solutions. None of those solutions require an increase in police budget. Indeed, one solution even suggests the removal of police from responding to overdose calls, as their regular involvement discourages people from seeking the services they need. Second, the Winnipeg Police Service does not address street violence. As you've already heard, there's a Canadian study released in October 2023 that suggests there is no correlation between police funding and crime rates. Additionally, suggesting that police reduce street violence ignores the instances in which street violence is produced by the police. Violence in Winnipeg inflicted by the Winnipeg Police Service is the production of the very street violence that police claim to prevent. Finally, the Winnipeg Police Service does not effectively address aggressive retail theft. In a year in which Winnipeg food banks have been pushed to the brink due to more and more Winnipeggers relying on them to contend with increased cost of living and economic insecurity, criminalizing that insecurity is not only ineffective but actively harmful. No level of police reaction to retail theft will address the underlying issues which lead people to theft. I, in many of the jobs that I've had, like probably you all, have had performance reviews. In those instances, if I'm failing to perform my duties, it's a pretty rare occurrence that I'll receive a massive windfall or a sudden wage increase or a nice bonus. I would say that in a similar logic, if the police board is interested in providing the Winnipeg Police Service with an additional $15.1 million, it seems to me as though that is a tacit endorsement that the Winnipeg Police Service is performing their duties exceptionally. That despite the fact that a Southern Chiefs organization survey of police interactions with Indigenous people indicated that 70% of respondents who had interacted with the police had experienced racism during those interactions, that the Winnipeg Police Service is performing their duties exceptionally. That, despite the Winnipeg Police Service killing 7 people in 2024 alone, the Winnipeg Police Service is performing their duties exceptionally. Personally, it would not come as a significant surprise to hear that the police budget advocated for and the City Council approved the budget increase. Despite the police board's council membership's role as democratic representatives of Winnipeg citizens, the near constant praise of Winnipeg Police Service ineffective attempts at public safety would make you think otherwise, that they are cheerleaders for police interests rather than representatives of our community as a whole. However, perhaps it's time to question whether the interests of the Winnipeg Police Service are aligned with the interests of Winnipeg as a whole, if we are interested in creating a vibrant community capable of uplifting vulnerable members of our communities, dealing with serious public health issues with care, and investing in a meaningful chance for Winnipeg to flourish, or if we are aligned with the Winnipeg Police Service. Thank you very much.
Any questions from board members? Seeing none, thank you very much for your presentation today.
Last delegation is David Grant, also joining us on Zoom.
Hello.
Good morning, David. You have 10 minutes to present to committee this morning.
Thank you very much. I feel I must begin by making clear that I favor steady and increased funding for the WPS, as opposed to some of the other delegations. I support just about every aspect of city police operations. I thank everyone here for all that you do. The budget book is very thick and pretty. On page 360, it promises us a safe city. We often hear that the WPS exists to make us safe. There was a mayor once who forbade police from arresting certain offenders if they seemed unhoused. He is long gone. Could someone explain the strategy that will protect good, sober people from those under the influence? Will the new person who you choose as chief be allowed to bring or develop such a strategy? Does the published job description limit, I haven't read it in enough detail and its implications, does it limit the new chief in this important policy area? Because we're hoping for new and better things with this new person. On page 361, we learn that the WPS has a, quote, statutory responsibility to enforce the law, prevent crime, and preserve the public peace, quotes. This seems inconsistent with City Hall's level of tolerance for misbehavior in and out of encampments. Until City Hall's policing policy changes a lot, why are these words still in use? They seem good, but they seem inconsistent. Also on page 361 of your budget document is the data on traffic fatalities investigated. Good sign, as it seems to be going down a lot. When only a person on foot has the power to prevent a collision, those speaking in delegation at City Hall are forbidden from saying so. When a person steps into traffic between crosswalks and without looking for oncoming traffic, the vehicle operator involved too often cannot prevent any injury. When WPS investigates and publishes its results, are you or your folks allowed to assign a percent responsible to a person who is on foot involved in the collision? I would fear that they'd be, if they're forbidden from assigning fault like that, that we don't have really useful data generated. On pages 145 to 147, we see spending on high-tech tools to catch white-collar criminals. This seems very good. When WPS reports to the board and the public, why is this topic not mentioned? What fraction of public mischief complaints are actually investigated? What fraction of computer-based complaints are investigated? Are the routine reports from the WPS silent on white-collar crime because it's not a priority? We see stats on violent crime, nonviolent, and so on, but nothing on white-collar. When the prior chief failed to realize the PE income, photo enforcement income target that council had set, he made reference to the lack of special enforcement situations. Recall that when the DCZ PE law was introduced in 2013, the law protected the parts of the road surface being repaired or closed, temporarily closed for repair. The law and the related engineering diagrams do not enable PE tickets for travel hundreds of meters outside the actual repair zone. Traffic safety professionals wince when they see our DCZs. In a place where worker safety matters, concrete barriers protect workers. All across the USA, Jersey barriers protect road workers, but not in Manitoba. Since most of those special situations, PE enforcement situations in the past decade, have involved signage that is missing or misleading, and since we cannot count on that in 2025, I ask, is it wise to have PE income in your budget? If the legally required reports on safety improvements are ever published, the PE program will probably evaporate. I suggest that it is not prudent for your 2025 budget to depend on photo enforcement profits. And I ended there, and thank you again for all that you're doing for policing Winnipeg.
Thank you, Mr. Grant. Any comments or questions from board members this morning? Seeing none, thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you.
Have
Bye.
a good day.
Yep, bye.
Okay, so that concludes all of our delegations. Okay, we'll move into budget review. And so at this point, we'll turn it over to the service for their presentation on the multi-year budget, 2025 budget update.
Hey, good morning, everybody. Just first, Happy New Year to all of you and best for 2025. As you know, we presented a few months ago our draft budget, which was approved by the police board, and it went to a budget working group. At that time, there was 4 change documents made at that time, and they would be incorporated in our presentation today. Before we start, I do want to acknowledge and thank the police board, the mayor, and the working group for the additional police officers. As you know, I've been speaking on this issue for a number of months. I think it's important that we need more coverage out there to protect our community. So thank you for that. I won't say much more. I'll turn it over. It's in 2 parts. David's going to talk about the service highlights and the business plan statements, some of the performance reporting, and then Tara will get into the budget itself. So,
well, and before turn it over, I note that there was a presentation on Friday to SBC Finance. And I know that some board members weren't there, but if you care to share with the board so that we're all aware of what happened on Friday morning.
sure. Our timing processes are out of whack with other activities. And so when we had our Q3 forecast, it looked like we would have a deficit at the end of the year. We kind of knew that things will be better in the 4th quarter, but we had to put in our expenditure management or expenditure report at that time. So we did that. I was pleased to announce on Friday with you that we met budget, and I'm further pleased to announce we would be about 2.5 plus over under budget. So that would be returned to the city to help them with the challenges. So I definitely commend our finance unit for keeping us on track and holding us accountable. Our senior officers, our management team as well to keep their members accountable, and to our sergeants on the front lines and to the supervisors on the front line to hold. We do take the budget seriously. I know a lot of people don't think we do out there, but we really actually do, and we try our best to keep within budget, and we do make some tough decisions throughout the year. So it's a good news story for us this year. So thank you.
And certainly, since I've been on council, this is, I believe, the second time that the service has returned money back to general revenue of the city of Winnipeg. So thank you very
I
much.
only put on Friday because it was, like I said, it was bad news. I was gonna let you go by yourself, but it was good news. So yeah, why not? So thank you for that. So
Okay,
we can take it.
thank you.
I think we'll go right into, David Bowman's gonna go through some, service highlights and, performance reporting.
Morning, everyone. I'm here to provide an overview of how the Winnipeg Police Service is responding to the growth in demand for its services, our ability to meet that demand, and the combined impact on our organizational performance. In short, the demand being placed on our service is outpacing our current supply of resources. In 2024, there were nearly 780,000 total calls to the communications center. This represents an increase of 13% over the 5-year average and over 2,000 calls each day. While the number of calls to our communications center continues to increase, the number of events that we're able to dispatch officers to has maxed out. Dispatched events decreased slightly in 2024 and were relatively unchanged from the 5-year average. So when we see increasing calls for service as we do in the top left, paired with dispatched events plateauing as we see in the top right, this indicates we've reached an organizational saturation point where service demand is outpacing available resources. The surplus of demand begins to spill over, and we see the service deficit materializes in places like a growing event queue and a growing number of non-dispatched events, as I'll speak to in a couple of slides. Looking in the bottom left, emergency events for service. These are high priority, resource intensive events, often requiring 2 to 4 times more units than urgent and non-urgent events. Emergency events are relatively unchanged from the previous year, but are 7% higher than the 5-year average and continue to put a significant strain on our frontline resources. Finally, looking in the bottom right portion, in 2024, we're projecting a 1% decrease in total crime, driven by decreases in the majority of violent and property crime categories. Notable increases in other crimes, which are driven primarily by bail and probation violations, as well as traffic crimes, driven by increased detection of impaired driving. Other crimes and traffic crimes are primarily proactive and officer driven. So even amid resource challenges, targeted enforcement initiatives are making an impact in these areas. Looking now to our complement. Winnipeg's population has grown by nearly 20% over the past 10 years, while during the same time frame, the number of police officers in the city has decreased by 7%, with a reduction of 40 officers. Even with the addition of new officers taking place over the past 3 years, these additions have not kept us at pace with population growth. As a result, the officer to population ratio has been shrinking in our city since 2013. The addition of 18 new officers in each of 2025 and 2026 have been forecasted here, and this will interrupt the downward trend that we've seen over the last decade, matching the service's growth with that of the city of Winnipeg. When we consider the number of officers in our city in relation to total crime severity, an inverse relationship exists. As the number of police officers in the city, depicted here in blue, increased between 2004 and 2013, crime severity in the city decreased. When the number of police officers decreased between 2013 and 2022, crime severity increased. So the intent here is not to suggest a causal relationship between the number of officers and crime severity, but rather to provide some context within which we were decreasing our complement. So in short, while the crime severity in the city was increasing over a decade, the number of police officers was in decline. This isn't a trend unique to Winnipeg, however. That said, the relationship is more pronounced here. So over that last decade, on average, Canadian police agencies reduced their uniform complement to population ratios by about 10%, whereas Winnipeg reduced it by 18%. And we look at that in relation to crime severity. Canada's crime severity increased by about 17% over the last decade, while Winnipeg's crime severity increased by 53%. So the overall trend seen nationally is similar to that of Winnipeg's, but here in Winnipeg, we decreased our complement more sharply. At the same time, our crime severity was increasing more significantly. And when we look at some specific municipalities that were mentioned previously, for example, in terms of cop to pop, Montreal, over that 10-year span, decreased its officer complement to population ratio by 4%, Calgary 8%, Edmonton 3%, Regina 5%, Saskatoon 8%, Ottawa 7%, whereas we've seen Winnipeg decreased by 18%. So those other jurisdictions, quite modest reductions, whereas Winnipeg's far more pronounced. So looking at Winnipeg in relation to other policing jurisdictions around the country, Winnipeg is consistently at or near the top among Canadian municipalities in total crime severity, as I've depicted here in the top left, as well as violent crime severity seen in the top right. While some smaller cities like Kamloops, Chilliwack, Red Deer, and Lethbridge ranked higher than Winnipeg in total CSI in 2023, when looking at major municipalities with populations over 500,000, Winnipeg is number 1. Winnipeg's total crime severity index has been on average 57% higher than the national index. In terms of violent crime, Winnipeg's violent crime severity index has been on average nearly double the national index. A primary driver for Winnipeg's violent crime severity is our robbery rate. So Winnipeg's rate of robbery was more than double that of Saskatoon and Regina last year, triple that of Edmonton, and many times greater than Calgary and the Canadian average. Looking now at the bottom left, our sworn officer criminal caseload. This is basically the total number of crimes in the city divided by the number of officers. So as you can see, Winnipeg officers on average carry a much higher caseload than their peers in other jurisdictions across the country. And finally, in the bottom right, amid the high crime rates, crime severity, and officer caseload, WPS performs quite well in terms of violent crime clearance rate. Specifically, Winnipeg has consistently been well above the national average with respect to homicide clearance rates. We've been above 80% over the last decade, and last year we were in the high 80s or 90s for homicide clearance rate. So ranking quite high nationally in that respect.
Just a quick question before you move on. What did those numbers at the top of that bar graph represent on weighted violent crime rate clearance rates? Like 47.9 for Winnipeg.
Yeah, so that is a weighted clearance rate. So it kind of factors in the severity of the crime. So our raw clearance rate, for example, for violent crime is about 55%, but when we factor in the severity of the crime, it indexes those crimes higher. So if you solve a homicide, that counts more to the index than, say, solving and uttering threats.
Thank you.
So looking now at our demand, as I mentioned at the outset, when we see increasing calls to the communication center and our dispatched events plateauing, it suggests we've reached a saturation point. That surplus of demand begins to spill over, and we see the service deficit materialize in the form of a growing event queue and subsequent increases in non-dispatched events, which are displayed here in the top right. In 2024, non-dispatched events, calls we weren't able to get to, reached a historic high and increased for the 4th year in a row. And while these calls tend not to be life-threatening or present imminent risk, they do warrant police attention, and were a resource available, we would be dispatching to them. Things like disturbances, check well-beings, shoplifting, and traffic events. The public expects a police response to these everyday public safety issues, as seen in our public opinion survey results. During our prime time between May and August, the queue of pending events routinely hovered around 300 events, reaching a record high of 440 events on August 31st, the Saturday night of the Labor Day weekend last year. A number of strategies are in play to manage the queue, but the backlog remains an ongoing issue. So looking at a couple of heat maps here, representing crime change in our city as well as our responses to crime. Looking first at the map on the left. This is a heat map of crime in our city, but it's not a traditional heat map in the sense that it maps crime density. Rather, it's mapping where crime is changing in our city. So the red areas represent the highest levels of crime increases in our city, and the blue areas represent where crime is decreasing in our city.
Is that all crime?
All crime, correct. And what we can see here is that there is a notable pattern, I would say, is that the peripheral areas of our city, so in the northwest quadrant, the southwest and east quadrants is where we're seeing the largest increases in crime. Now, some of that is partly a function of population growth because this is where our city is developing the most, as I noted in the south and north ends of the city. When we look at our responses to crime, we can kind of see a relationship between where crime is changing in our city and our median emergency response time. So when we look at the map on the left, or sorry, on the right, we can also see that those high crime areas on the peripheral of the city are also the areas that it's taking us the longest to get to. Now, in terms of response, this is partly a function of geography. These outlying areas have a longer distance to travel, but rapid population growth and by extension, increased calls for service and increased crime in these areas are driving up wait times. One further note about these maps, just to say that as a data-driven, evidence-based organization, these are the types of insights that we use internally to inform how we deploy any additional resources that may be coming in the future. And finally, looking at our survey results from 2024, in the top right, we can see that half of Winnipeggers feel the city has too few officers. And that's not to say that the other half feels that we are overfunded or have too many officers. Only 6% feel as though we have too many officers in the city. And looking at the bottom of the slide, when we ask citizens what is their top policing priority in the city, year after year, they tell us that responding promptly to calls for service is their #1 policing priority. And it also happens to be the thing that they are least satisfied with the Winnipeg Police Service on. So we do see that translate into lower ratings of overall quality for the service. That concludes my portion of the presentation.
Any questions?
Yes, quick questions. Board members, any questions? Going back to slide 8, 2024 crime change and median emergency response times by neighborhood. And I've got a few questions here. So firstly on that map, going to the left map, I see no change in the south area of the city, but then when I look at crime change and median response times by neighborhood, the south area is dotted in either orange, burnt orange, or darker orange. I also noticed that there is no station there, and it seems to be higher impacted. Is there a correlation to, and from what I see here on the map to the right, is where the stations are located, Shaftesbury, North District, Downtown, and East District, it's blue. It looks like crime is decreasing. Any thought about a station in the south area of the city?
I brought that up before, and I guess last week when we saw a temporary fire station there, we heard we never reported when you don't need it for fire service anymore, we might be making a report. We go there and make it its all station. So I think that would solve a lot of issues. The coverage is not there.
Going back to the benchmarking slide on page 6, and it does talk about the crime severity index, and even before that, slide 5, and more so slide 5, it talks about cop to pop ratio. Does that have an impact on response times?
It speaks to the number of available policing resources in the city. And I think if we kind of pair this with our understanding of where the city is growing, as we just showed on those maps, and the relationship between our policing stations and where we're getting to the calls more quickly and where we're not getting to the calls more quickly, I think it's reasonable to draw a line between, you know, the number of available resources and where they are stationed and how they respond.
Okay, so I believe it was Mr. Wilton who brought up the comment on adequate and effective policing. And so my question is, does the cop to pop ratio speak to adequate and effective service? Are there numbers that we need to have as a city, as a municipality? And then given the crime severity index that says, yes, if we have this number for this population, we can provide adequate and effective policing services.
Yeah, so to the previous comments, I don't think it's as simple as the cop to pop, because it really depends on what's being asked of the police service. The benchmarking in the bottom left here, the sworn officer criminal caseload, that takes a look at the volume of crime and the volume and severity of crime that our officers are being presented with on average. So you can see that Winnipeg is quite high in terms of what we're asking our officers to do. So being spread very thin in that respect. So I think we need to look at it beyond just the cop to pop, because Ottawa and Vancouver and Calgary have very different policing environments to that of Winnipeg. They're being presented with far less in terms of volume per officer. So that bottom left caseload, I think, is very telling in terms of where other municipalities are in terms of what's being asked of their officers.
So something like an environmental scan to see what issues police are responding to and what the environment of crime is in their cities, that has an impact on it.
Absolutely. I think you have to take into consideration the crime severity and the crime volume, not just the cop to pop measurement.
Thank you very much. Mayor Gillingham and then Damon Johnson.
Thank you. The crime severity index metric and the way that's calculated, has that been consistently calculated across Canada for years, and is that changing? I thought that maybe they were going to look at how they use the metric and maybe make some changes to it. Can you speak to that, please?
Yeah, so the crime severity index has been in place since the late 90s, 1998. I think it came into effect in the early 2000s, but they kind of backdated it to 1998. So that methodology has been consistent and in place for over 20 years. Within the last few years, there has been some discussion about the index itself, primarily around how it's presented and sometimes how it can reflect poorly on smaller communities. So for example, a smaller jurisdiction like Kamloops or Lethbridge, if they were to, suddenly have 2 or 3 homicides in that jurisdiction, that would rapidly drive up the severity index partially because of their smaller population. So you oftentimes you can see large year-over-year increases in the crime severity for smaller jurisdictions. But to my knowledge, I know Statistics Canada has undergone some review of the index, but there are no immediate plans to change the methodology of the formula in place. But they have adjusted the way in which they're presenting some of that data so as to not, reflect too poorly on some of these smaller communities.
Again, my second question is related to the graph of the chart in the top right-hand corner, the violent crime severity index. We often hear or read in media when individuals that are committing violent crime are arrested, that frequently it seems they're breaching a court order, they're out or something like that, that this is not their first time around and that they've been picked up and they're in breach of their court order. So I guess the question is, does that factor into, and does that factor into Winnipeg's violent crime severity index as compared to Vancouver? Probably is a better way to say it, but Toronto, Vancouver, Edmonton, are those justice systems in those provinces doing a better job of keeping people behind incarcerated? And then it's different here. So is it a measurement also? I don't know. Is it a measurement of effectiveness? Might be the wrong word. Is it a measurement of the impact of a provincial justice system?
It's a complex question. I don't have benchmarking specifically on, like, say, the proportion of violent crimes that are being attributed to people on bail or probation in other jurisdictions. In our jurisdictions in Winnipeg, it's about 1 in 5. 1 in 5 violent crimes cleared by charge also involve an offender who's breaching some sort of bail or probation. When the federal government introduced new legislation early last year to hopefully kind of stem some of that, we have seen some modest progress in terms of the proportions of violent crime attributable to people on bail and probation, specifically in the areas of robberies and commercial robberies. So we have seen some downtrend in that proportion, but I can't say specifically how that looks in other jurisdictions.
David, please.
Yeah, so media coverage of late has suggested that organized crime is on the rise. And so it's organized crime in Winnipeg, then the absence of a station in the south end suggests or infers that these people know there's no coverage. There's not as much coverage there. They're supposed to cover and probably planning their crimes in that area. Let us say. That makes sense.
I don't know if I could speak to that specifically. It's a fairly complex question. Organized crime takes a lot of shapes and forms, whether it's on the streets or online. We've seen a lot of growth in cybercrime and other kind of crime categories like that. So I don't know if I'd fix a specific geography to it like that.
I think in those areas, property crime as well. You know, because there are new developments there are new residents, and so we find that there's a lot of property crime there as well.
It might be something we're looking at. It just, it seems to make sense. If I'm stealing or whatever, and I know there's no, it'll take the police longer to get there, to catch me, I'm probably thinking going to that area. Just, I think there's a strong business case to have a station in the south end sooner than later.
Thank you. Any other questions, board members? Okay, seeing none, we'll go to our next presenter.
Okay, we're going to look at the dollars now. So a quick budget overview for 2025. For 2025, the service will contribute to one of the city's service-based budget, that's police services. And as a reminder, board, your budget is included in all the figures that you're seeing today. As noted in this table, there will be 2018 FTEs. And since I'll be using that term a few times today, FTE means full-time equivalent or full-time employee, maybe call them members or employees. So that's 2018. For 2025, there'll be a total mill rate support of just over 293 million and a capital budget of 6.4 million. In the upcoming slides, we'll dive deeper into all of these numbers. We'll start with the service-based operating budget. So 2 graphs on the screen now for you. Revenues on the left. Revenues for 2025 will be just under 60 million. You can see from the pie chart that it is primarily provincial funding. And regulation fees makes up the second largest category at 28%. That's primarily traffic enforcement fines. And sale of goods and services is the third and final category at 16%. This is going to be all the police services. So you'll have things like criminal record checks and fingerprinting and other police services like escorts and special duty. Expenses on the right, 352.6 million. You can see that salary and benefits on the left is the largest category at 85%. This is very consistent with prior years. On the far right of this bar chart, 4%, that's the budget, the percentage of the budget that's related to debt and financing. You'll recall that in recent years, the majority of our capital has been funded with debt. And all of the projects in the upcoming years are funded with debt. So that's taking up a percentage of our budget, 4% this year. Just in 2023, it was under 2.8%. So this is a category that is growing. And then finally, in the middle of this chart, purple, 2%, that is other grants and transfers category. And that includes a $5 million expenditure management savings target. So what that means is that there's $5 million savings built into the budget, and that is allocated within that other grants and transfers category. Okay, this table that.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes.
Sorry, can I ask a question?
Fine,
on
good.
that?
Yeah.
Under the, excuse me, regulation fees for revenues. Given now the Winnipeg Police Service Traffic Division has responsibility for the south perimeter, did you, I guess, estimate an increase in traffic fines related to that work year over year?
We have we have like 20 years of data on traffic enforcement. So we have to look at a large number of things there. So looking at the last year and the last 6 months certainly does play into our projections, but these are very difficult to estimate because, as you know, the revenue for fines is included in our budget, but collection of those is not under the discretion of the city or the police service. That's under the courts that get to decide what we actually get to collect. And we don't get a lot of data on that. Can't get a lot of data from justice on that. So we only have so much data to be able to estimate. So the short of it is that we consider that, but it's difficult to say for sure if we're counting for enough.
Through 2024, was there an increase, I guess, in fines issued or tickets given by the Winnipeg Police Service Traffic Division because now the Winnipeg Police Service is responsible for the south perimeter?
Well, that information I don't have available today.
I was just gonna say, we have been responsible for the south perimeter for a long time. It's just different portions of it. It was the entire perimeter where there were different areas of jurisdiction between the RCMP and the city of Winnipeg. And it became pretty complex. So as a result of the agreement with the RCMP, they were gonna take the north from the number one east and west side, and we're gonna take the south. So we've always been enforcing part of the south perimeter. It's just the entirety of it now. But it is something we'll be watching as far as if we are seeing finding. Anecdotally, we had our overtime presentation from traffic, and there has been an increase in enforcement down there, but at this point, I don't think we can determine if it has increased our revenues at all.
Go ahead, Damon.
No, so last week I shared an article from the Globe and Mail that spoke to the efficacy of radar. The use of photo radar is legitimate in terms of being a way to decrease the speed that people are driving on their streets, which is a huge safety issue. My own driving around town, I changed my habit of driving. I don't speed anymore. I stay at the limit, even though people get angry at you. But it's, it appears to be an increasing issue in our city. People running lights. I was taught years ago that light turns caution, you slow down, come to a stop, not breaking through the intersection at high speed. Increasing the possibility of serious accident you do hit somebody. But for some time now, we've been talking in the board and with the service about the ability of the province to upgrade or give money to upgrade the radar system, photo radar system in our city. Is there any indication that that's changing or that may happen in the future?
So it's not money that's needed from the province to upgrade the equipment. It's the approval of the equipment in regulation. So we are continuing to work with the province on that. It's received some positive indications, and so we're working toward the approval of that equipment. And so once that occurs, that will increase the flexibility of the service to put the intersection safety cameras in other locations where there are problems with respect to speeding and running red lights. and accidents. So those will be data informed decisions in terms of the deployment that we look forward, and fingers crossed that hopefully that will happen in a timely way, but we're continuing to work with the province.
One quick question, and it will likely not be you, Tara, to respond, but more so David. And it just came to me when we were talking about revenues. So in other jurisdictions, Toronto, Peel Region and whatnot, they have quite the issue with auto theft. How does that rank in crime severity index? Because some of them are done quite violently.
Yeah, so when violence is presented during the theft of a vehicle, that becomes a carjacking. So that would, it's technically classified under a robbery. So it would push it into a violent crime category and thus carry a much higher crime severity weight. What we see in Winnipeg is we haven't seen the year over year or even year over 5 year increases in auto theft that some of those other jurisdictions have. We keep a pretty close eye on things like auto theft, carjackings, and also the make and model of vehicles that are being stolen. The other metric that we keep an eye on is recovery rates. So we have a very high rate of recovery of stolen vehicles here in Winnipeg. So somewhat of a different experience in Winnipeg. So I wouldn't say that the auto theft numbers in Winnipeg are a main contributor to the.
No, and I'm not meaning to suggest that, but what I'm saying is that it is higher in those other jurisdictions. I don't see the correlation in terms of a higher crime severity index for those jurisdictions.
Correct. Yeah, auto theft overall wouldn't contribute significantly to the crime severity index. The carjackings, the violent carjackings would, which we're not seeing here yet, but certainly in some of those other areas.
They also experience the home invasions where they kick the door and go in and grab the keys and leave. Those would be reflected in their violent crime indexes in those cities.
And that's not happening in the university.
No. It's proximity to the Port of Montreal is really the major factor in all of this. A lot of those cars are being stolen or going offshore, going overseas.
Thank God we're in my.
On a day like today, that is our saving grace, yes.
Right, Daphne?
Just getting back to the conversation about the cameras. How long have we been working and trying to get the regulation changed so that we could do some upgrading, further implementation?
Well, we first made the request more than 7 years ago. But we are probably in the last, I would say, 6 months to a year. We've worked very closely with Manager of Infrastructure Transportation as well as Justice to move those forward. We work very closely with them. We've had a very positive education, and I think at this point it's just a matter of time and getting through the process. There are regulations that do require cabinet approval, so it's a little bit more onerous of a process to get that regulation approved.
Any other questions before Tara proceeds? Go ahead.
Okay, so we're going to compare the 2024 adopted budget to the 2025 budget. So this table that you're seeing here now demonstrates that there is an increase in both revenue and expense in 2025 over 2024. So to summarize, there's a $5.2 million increase in revenue. And that's related to a couple of things. One being revenue related to the new provincially funded initiatives, but there are offsetting expenses that's related to that, directly related to that. Also contributing to the increase in revenue is volumes related to criminal record checks and special duty. And there are some offsetting expenses for that as well. With respect to expenses, increasing just over 6% at $20.4 million. And that includes increases that are related to our negotiated collective bargaining agreement. So there is an annual increase in there. That's a big piece of it. Another component that's contributing to the increase in expenses are the expenses that are related to those provincially funded initiatives with the offsetting revenue. And a fall recruit class in 2025 that includes an additional 18 officers. We're going to talk more about that in the next section of the presentation, as well. An increase in debt and financing. And a decrease in the expenditure management savings target. So that target was 7 million in 2024, and it went down to 5 million in 2025. So that means it's an increase in the budget. So we're going to go into look now at comparing the 2025 projection that was approved by council last year to the 2025 budget that we're considering here today. So essentially, what has changed in the last year? So as you can see in the table that there are slight increases in the mill rate support for 2025 through 2027. And on average for those 3 years, it's about an increase of 1.6% each year. And these increases are primarily related to 2 directed changes within the budget update. One of them being the expenditure management savings target going down to 5 million in 2025 and 6 million in 2026 and 2027, right? So if the savings target decreases, the budget automatically goes up a little bit. And the second component is that increase in general patrol resources. So as I noted, we will have a fall recruit class that has an additional 18 officers in 2025. They'll be deployed in the spring of 2026. There will be an additional 18 in a fall of 2026 recruit class to be deployed in 2027. So what this means is that although the funding is starting to flow later this year, it does take a couple of years to actually get those officers on the street. That equates to 2 cruiser cars that are deployable 24/7. Okay, look at overview of the salary budget now. So the table you're seeing here today is showing an increase of 13 FTE in 2025 over 2024, and that relates to 3 items. The first is the prorated impact of the provincially funded initiatives that began in 2023. So that equates to 6 FTEs. Another 6 relates to that increase in general patrol that I just mentioned. If you have a fall class of 18, that equates to 6 in 2025. And then the 13th is for 1, and that was for a conversion of non-salary dollars into salary for an aircraft maintenance engineer. So there's no mill rate impact on that. It was simply a reallocation within the budget. The increases in FTEs for 2026 and 2027 are the prorated impacts due to the further recruit classes in 2026. And there are no other FTE increases projected for 26 and 27. We're now going to look at the capital budget. Okay, so the table you see here today summarizes the capital budget for the 6-year authorization period that ends in 2030. In 2024, the capital budget was 6.7 million and that was for WPS capital projects only. For 2025 through 2030, the table is identifying other city departments that are contributing and budgeting capital for the service. So for 2025, 2 million is directly related to police service operations, and that's primarily renewing existing infrastructure. Municipal accommodations is budgeting just under 2 million for building maintenance for city-owned police buildings, and that's funded through our annual accommodations cost that's included as part of our operating budget. And Winnipeg Fleet Management is also budgeting 2.3 million, and that's for planned replacement of vehicles. That's also funded through the annual operating budget for the police service. Beyond 2026, the Fleet Management Agency did not allocate out their capital to service-based budgets, so that's why you're seeing it blank in that table there. The total 6-year is just over 47 million for police services. We're now going to look at some key programs within the capital budget. So the tiles that you're seeing here right now represent the key capital programs for 2025 through 2030. At the top left is public safety communication equipment. So this is our radio infrastructure. On the right, public safety answering point equipment. So that would be technology related to our 911 communication center. There's also information and technology infrastructure program. So think of that as being our IT network. Also, the information technology mobile program. So that's the equipment that supports our members in the field. Facility adaptation program. So this is capital that supports the WPS facilities like renovations. And finally, information and technology strategic initiative programs. That's primarily our connected officer program. Each program has one or more project that's allocated within. And once you dive into the details of all the projects, you can very quickly see that there's a significant reliance on technology and police operations. And there's regular renewals that are required, or also known as evergreening, on this infrastructure. And what I mean by evergreening is that our technology needs to be upgraded and updated in a very similar way that we all must update our phones and computers regularly. In addition, oh, pardon me, sorry, Counselor?
Yeah, quick question. The facilities adaptation program, is any of that the conversion that we experienced back in COVID when housing of criminals, the province gave $5 million for the conversion? Is any of that adaptation program part of that?
No, there's none of that is related, no.
Can you give an example of what the adaptation program is?
It'll be like looking at, I think a good component of it is looking at like our training facility and how that might be changed to consolidate like the track and the firing range.
So these are
Renovations.
specific activities to policing, not necessarily the accommodation of those that are remanded into custody.
Yes, that's correct. Okay, yeah, I think that's it. We'll move on. Just a quick look at capital budget changes. So again, this is anything that's changed in the last year from what was forecasted for capital to the numbers we're looking at and considering today. So this table itemizes those changes. You're seeing a lot of blanks. That's because every year we consider the previous year authorization, reprioritize a little bit and try to stay within the existing allocation. And that's exactly what happened for 2025 through 2029. That's why you're seeing a lot of blanks in the tables here. We were able to stay within that allocation. 2030 is the new year that comes into the 6-year authorization window at just over 9 million. And as a final note, just some budget pressures, board, to make you aware of. So the first one being expenditure management. So as you know, that's 5 million in 2025 and 6 million in 26 and 2027. So there's always that risk of not meeting the savings target for a couple of reasons. A big one is the timing and the outcome of collective bargaining negotiations in our police pension. So our contracts expire at the end of this year, and pending the outcome of those negotiations, that could impact the existing budget allocation, as well as the police pension valuation that's also due at the end of this year. And as we are all aware, that can sometimes result in material swings on our budget. The impact of inflation on non-salary budget lines, our department is not immune to those. Every city department has to pay attention to inflation. An upward trend in the use of overtime to address demands for service. So David spoke a little bit about that, and we certainly saw that in 2024. So certainly something that we have to keep a very close pulse on as we enter 2025. In addition, escalation in workers' compensation boards claims, volume of claims, and also those costs, we are starting to see that rise at a very rapid rate. So we're flagging that here as another item that we're going to need to pay very close attention to as we enter in 2025. And finally, volumes of major critical incidents, complexity of investigations, and the increased population of our city, as well as the increased footprint. So all the things that David was speaking about just a moment ago. General patrol resources. So you may recall that we had requested 4 additional cruiser cars to be staffed 24/7, and we're very happy to have received 2. But as I noted, there's that increased use of overtime to address demands for service. So we'll have to see if there's any impact of that additional 2. Fine revenues, we've talked a little bit about that already, and as you note, we note this as a risk every year, and you're familiar with the historic shortfalls. So as I said, revenue does form part of our budget, but the city doesn't have any say in the actual fines that are being collected. Externally funded positions, this is also a revenue risk. This would be our school resource officer, but there's also other positions like MPI funds a stolen auto unit. And there are support positions for gang response that are funded by Justice. So if the funding goes, that means there's an increase in the mill rate, an increase in the tax supported budget. We also have those new initiatives like missing persons, downtown safety, and the violent offender apprehension unit. There's no financial risk there. If the funding is terminated, the expenses will go away as well. But if there's an operational need to continue, then we have another unfunded risk. Body worn cameras is another one. I think we're all aware of the calls to equip our members with body worn cameras and the need to wait until after the appointment of a new chief. But this is an item that is currently unfunded. Police HQ level 1, so our police HQ downtown, our level 1 requires some major restoration to remain in service. The identified areas of work will impact a number of operational areas that are going to need to be moved. We're going to have to implement business continuity measures. We've confirmed with Property Planning and Development that they have included this repair on their unfunded risk list. But when it comes to the business continuity measures that we're going to need to implement to continue continue those operational areas, that is also an unfunded item that will be on the police service. So this is something that we need to gather information on and examine more closely. We'll be bringing that forward as part of the 2026 budget update, but this is just something for your awareness at this time. And then finally, our evidence archive building and racking. So as you know, this is where we house long-term exhibits, namely for homicides and sex crimes, and we are beginning to reach maximum capacity. We're actively managing that to ensure there's no capacity issues, but a new facility is still going to be required to house those exhibits, and that is currently unfunded at this time as well. That is all for budget pressures, and now we have time for any more questions. Thank you.
Yeah, just go back to slide 19, please. Just if you could help me understand this table a little more clearly. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay.
And so this is the programs, right? Capital programs, I'm assuming?
Yep.
So what the one line is 2030 forecast of $6 million. What is 2030 forecast? Is that a little bits amounts in each of the programs?
Yes.
Okay. So which programs would be included in that $6 million forecast through 2030?
I don't know that I have all of those details handy with me at this exact time, but it's gonna, oh, pardon me, I do. You're gonna have things like radio. There's gonna be some radio renewals in 2023, or pardon me, 2030, for radios and for 911 communication center. That's a big chunk of it, almost like, about half. The other piece is in-car computing. So that's equipping our members on the field with technology and technical surveillance. And that's it. Yep.
So that's for 2030.
That's for 2030. That's the 6 million there. Those were the programs that were approved as part of the long-term forecast last year. The two new items that came into 2030 that were not part of last year's approved forecast were human resource software and additional equipment for the 911 communication center.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Emmett, go ahead.
So looking at the entire budget, I'd be interested in knowing what the capacity of the service is around the utilization of AI within the service going forward. And, the potential for that we create money. We can save money on some of the things you do.
That's tough to say right now. I mean, AI is advancing so quickly. So what's modern and effective now will change over the course of the next 2 years. Obviously, it's something we're looking at. We're very cognizant of the advancement in drones at the moment. We're seeing drones advancing at an incredible rate. Their abilities, their technologies. So it's something else that we're looking at. As for how it affects, it's something we're monitoring and watching very closely. And nationally, the CACP level, it has committees set up to study artificial intelligence and use of different technologies. So it's being looked at a national level. So what one police agency might adapt in Southern Ontario will be looked at across the country. So I think keeping us consistent and helping us all advance together as a united police front across the country is important. And it's something that's being done.
So you're comfortable that the service has the capacity it needs?
It's on our agenda right now, and we're collecting the initial data on it. It's overwhelming in some ways to interpret it, and but we have a committee assigned to it, and like Scott was saying, CACP and MAC are both kind of on top of it as well. That's a future thing we'll be watching for sure.
Yeah, National Police Services, part of the RCMP is, they actually just did a reach out last week for a particular technology that's able to search databases for photographs of people who have been arrested. So they're doing a reach out to see what agencies have this technology and how effective it is. So it's comforting to know it's being looked at nationally across the country, not just isolated in one police agency.
And of course, we have a pilot that's running in our communication center right now to assist with the response to non-emergency calls for service. So we look forward to that pilot continuing. Of course, that came out of one of the mayor's initiatives to look at AI, see whether or not it can improve customer service. So that is underway. And then we also have software on the investigative side with the increased use of cameras, of course. That means we have a lot of video evidence that comes in. And so we're in the process of putting in software that can assist from an investigative perspective. Software that's being used in all kinds of investigative capacities outside of the Winnipeg Police Service. So we look forward to seeing what kind of impact that will have so that an individual person doesn't have to go through and review the video evidence and see if that can save time and reduce the onus on individuals to do that work. So there's lots of opportunities, and as Acting Chief Standard noted, we have a committee that's looking at that. So it has representatives from across the service. So there's plenty of opportunities there. Sometimes it's just a matter of identifying like what we can put in place and where. Thank you.
Go ahead, Colleen.
Just next time for when we get together with the acting chief, can we have I feel like it's been a long time since we had a more fulsome discussion on things like the parking slab, the archive. Like I'd like more information when that time comes to bring the board up to date. I know probably some of that stuff is status quo, but I think it's time that the board, get a refresher on what's going on with some of those things. We read or we hear the conversation happening between the city and the province on body worn cameras, but I think that's a conversation that we, the board, need to have a deeper discussion on. So kind of on those unfunded risk parts that it's time for us to look back into some of our work that we haven't been able to get into.
And I might have heard it, maybe not, but in terms of the slab, is that the service's responsibility or municipal accommodations responsibility?
That should be PP&D or municipal accommodations. Yeah, the actual repair. It's the moving of those operational units. Where are they going to go? How are we going to manage that? The business continuity, that piece will be on the service.
Will it come at a cost?
Right. That's what we're looking at as we speak. Yeah.
Big cost. All right. Thank you. Any other questions? Okay. We have a motion here that I'll read into the public record. 2025 preliminary operating and capital budget. Whereas section 19 of the Winnipeg Police Board bylaw requires the Winnipeg Police Board, the board, to submit operating and capital estimates to council that will show the amounts will be required to maintain the Winnipeg Police Service and provide it with equipment and facilities. Whereas under subsection 29(1), the Winnipeg Police Services Act states to assist the council in developing the municipal budget, the police board must provide council with a estimate of costs required to operate the police service in the next 4 years and additional information that council considers necessary to establish it, to assess the financial requirements of the police service. And whereas subsection, and I realize that Diane doesn't have this, can you send it to Diane as well, please? Okay, thank you. The council is responsible for establishing the total budget of the police service. And whereas Chapter 7 of the Manitoba Police Commission's policy manual states the police board shall review the draft budget, including detailed submissions at special private board meeting for the purpose of budget review. In the review, the board members shall satisfy themselves that the budget is sufficient to maintain an adequate and effective police service. And whereas City Council, through the Chief Financial Officer, provided the board with an inter-office memorandum on August 26, 2024, outlining the budget guidelines for the 2025 and 2028 multi-year budget process. And whereas, per the multi-year budget policy, council may consider adjusting the approved operations budgets or projections and capital forecasts of the current budget cycle 2025 to 2028. And whereas the 4-year budget directive is to maintain 2025 to 2028 service levels consistent with the 2024 approved budget. And whereas the board, it has consulted extensively with the Winnipeg Police Service, reviewed reports prepared by the service, considered projections of the service's revenues and expenditures for the coming years, and emerging strategic priorities compared to the previous services budgets, and compiled with directions based on the decisions made by the budget working group. And whereas the Committee of the Whole met on private on June 14th, 2024, August 23rd, 2024, and November 22nd, 2024, to review budget estimates for the Winnipeg Police Service, and risks were identified to corporate finance to budget working group through the budget submission on June 27th, 2024. And whereas the Committee of the Whole met in private on December 16th, 2024, to review the preliminary 2025 operating and capital budget tabled by the Executive Policy Committee at its meeting on December 11th, 2024. And whereas the board at its public meeting on January 20th, today, 2025, reviewed the 2025 preliminary operating and capital budget for the Winnipeg Police Service. Therefore, be it resolved, and we're in the home stretch here, that the board provided council with an estimate of $352,255,999 as the total operating cost of the Winnipeg Police Service in 2025 that are required to maintain adequate and effective police service in Winnipeg, with the proviso that there are risks associated with $5,070,000 expenditure management target that could result in over expenditure authorizations requests in 2025. The board advised that it estimates the net mill rate support required for the Winnipeg Police Service in 2025 is $292,704,153 based on the revenue estimates of $59,551,846. That the board provide council with an estimate of $2,098,000 as the total cost for approval. Approved capital projects for the Winnipeg Police Service in 2025 that are required to maintain adequate and effective police service in Winnipeg, with a proviso that there is a risk such as replacement of critical equipment that remain unfunded. The board acknowledges that 2025 capital projects will be funded with external debt which will result in increased debt and financing costs in future years. That the board advise council of the risks associated with this budget recommendation, specifically the factors that may impact the budget expenditure management target. These risks includes not meeting the expenditure management target of $5,070,000 in 2025 and $6 million annually from 2026 to 2028 as a result of factors including but not limited to inflation on non-salary budget lines such as clothing, vehicles, computer hardware, computer and IT maintenance agreements exceeding balanced budget targets, timing and outcomes of collective bargaining agreement negotiations. The collective bargaining agreements expire on December 31st, 2025. A volume of major critical incidents, complexity of investigations, and increased demands on the service related to growth in calls for service and increased city population and the footprint of the city. Upward trend in the use of overtime to address demands for service, escalation of workers' compensation claims, and cost. Fine revenue from photo enforcement is impacted by the regulatory and legislative framework, which impacts the issuance of tickets. Risk range 2025 to 2028 estimates is estimated to between $1 million and $3 million. In accordance with pension legislations in Manitoba, the Winnipeg Police Pension Plan must be reviewed every 3 years, and an actuarial valuation must be filed with the pension regulator. The next valuation will occur no later than December 31st, 2025. The employer contribution rate may vary from year to year depending on the valuation. As a result, a financial impact unknown at this time could have a material impact on the budget retroactive to January 1st, 2026. Historically, the financial impact has experienced extreme fluctuations. And internally funded positions, school resource officers programs agreements end on June 30th, 2026. As a program is contingent on funding from participating school divisions, there's a risk that they will not be renewed relative to 11 full-time equivalent constables, or that signed agreements could be terminated. Impact members would be reassigned. MPI funds 2 FTE constables and 1 FTE crime analyst in stolen auto program. Manitoba Justice funds $145,000 to partially fund 2 FTE analysts for criminal organization high risk offenders unit. The Manitoba Justice funds up to $8.5 million for the Manitoba Integrated Violent Offenders Apprehension Unit, Manitoba Integrated Missing Persons Coordination Center, and Downtown Safety. Continued funding of these programs is subject to approval of future provincial budgets. Should the initiatives be terminated, funding will continue until the service can eliminate the positions through attrition. And lastly, the board has adhered to the Police Services Act and refers the 2025 preliminary operating and capital budget as they pertain to the Winnipeg Police Service and as tabled by the Executive Policy Committee to council for their consideration. I need somebody to move that motion. Damon, seconded by Colleen. All those in favor? Opposed? Carried.
Sorry, I was trying to raise my hand to clarify just one point. I'm not asking to change the motion, but to ensure that we're all clear on having an opportunity to review the budgets and the projections moving forward based on some of the information we heard today. So I know that's already stipulated in the motion that we're going to be looking at emerging matters as part of the budget review and planning in moving forward. But I just want to make sure we're all clear that there was some really important questions and vital information that was shared today that I'd like to incorporate into our process moving forward.
Thank you for those comments, entering them into the public record. Need a motion to adjourn?
So moved it as we did. Just want to wish our chair a happy birthday today.
Oh,
Happy birthday.
Thank you.
Move to adjourn.
And we stand adjourned. All those in favor? Opposed, carried. We stand adjourned.